Welcome to Understanding the Bible with Pastor Stephen. This is Season 3, Episode 30, Separation of Church and State. I think this one's pretty important as we approach election year and after the assassination attempt of President Trump. I've gotten a lot of emails and comments that it's not Christian of me to talk about politics, or that a particular group on social media is supposed to be about the Bible and not politics. Well, I think it's time to address it. There is no such thing as separation of church and state. All right, it is completely unbiblical, unconstitutional, and something that anyone who loves freedom should be against. All right, now let me get into it, and we'll talk about the law, the legalities of it, and what the Bible actually says about it. All right, here we go. So what does the Bible actually say about separation of church and state? Well, it doesn't. All right. But what we can learn is the principles taught in the Bible. If we look at the Old Testament, the entire Old Testament is all about the fact that God is king, ruler of the nation of Israel. He ran Israel as a theocracy. Religion ruled the nation. The Levites, the priests, were in charge. This is the exact opposite of separation of church and state. Judges were appointed like Moses, who led them out of Egypt, who spoke to God, who followed God's specific words for the nation. The exact opposite of separation of church and state. Then the people eventually demanded a king, and God still had his prophets advise them. Again, the exact opposite of separation of church and state. Because remember, oftentimes, if the king did not follow their advice, God judged them. So 1 Samuel 8:6 was when that first happened, where the people said, hey, we want a king. We don't want a judge or a prophet of God. And God allowed them to do that. But he still ordered and directed their nation. So the whole Old Testament is all about, even when it came to the kings, choosing a king that would listen to God and follow God's laws. So you can make the argument just from the Old Testament alone. And remember, God is a God that never changes. Even in the New Testament, it says Jesus never changes. So the argument is that God should be ruling the nation, should be ordering the church, and should be telling the nation, each individual citizen, what to do. So the idea of separation of church and state is completely unbiblical, all right? Now, if we look at the New Testament, it really doesn't talk about anything in regards to the state and politics and who's running the government and what the laws are, except for a couple of instances. So we have to look at what Jesus said and what his disciples taught about the way Christians are supposed to act, believers in Jesus Christ, right? And then from that, we can extrapolate on what that means when it comes to politics. So first of all, clearly Christians are supposed to show God's love to everyone. I mean, you look at Luke chapter 10, everyone you encounter must be treated like Jesus would treat them. The Good Samaritan, who's your neighbor? Anyone that you meet is your neighbor. You're supposed to show God's love to them, right? And then we have the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Well, that's straight out of the Bible, okay? That's not something Americans came up with, or the British, or anything like that. It's from Matthew 7:12. And Jesus said this, therefore all things whatsoever ye would that men should do to you, do ye even so to them. For this is the law and the prophets. So we need to constantly do things to other people that we wish they would do to us. Lower our taxes, let us keep more of our own money, make it easy to work, have good health care, like whatever you think you need that you would like to give to other people, that's what we want from, right? You can extrapolate the government into that, even though it's talking about individuals. But that embodies the entire law and the prophets, is what Jesus said. Then the second thing that we're supposed to do, as opposed to just treating people nice and being loving, right, is that we are to witness, tell other people about Jesus Christ everywhere we go. That's all through the Bible. Matthew 28, Jesus clearly says that. Go everywhere into the whole world. And of course, we're supposed to follow God's moral code. We need to be better humans than people who don't believe in God. 1 John 3:15, if you hate your brother, that's the equivalent of murder. So not only are you not supposed to murder, but you're not supposed to hate. Same thing with adultery. If you look at someone with lust, that's the same as actually committing adultery. Matthew 5:28. The 10 Commandments, don't covet what other people have. Don't ask the government to come in with their police officers and their IRS with guns to take away from the rich and give it to you. That's coveting. That's evil. That's unbiblical. Okay? The fruit of the Spirit, Galatians 5:22, love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, temperance. Against such there is no law. And they that are Christ's have crucified the flesh with the affections and lusts. If we live in the Spirit, let us also walk in the Spirit. So there's an admonition to not just live in this life, but live this life, walk this life in your daily actions, in every encounter that you have, in your job, and everything you do as a spiritual being doing the things of God. So far from advocating for separation of church and state, the Bible advocates for bringing our religion, our belief in God, our spirit-filled walk into everything we do. Choosing wise leaders, helping other people choose wise leaders, teaching other people what is right and wrong, living a good life, working not for men, but to please God, working hard and cheerfully and giving God the credit everywhere with every person. So 1 Thessalonians 5:15 says, see that none render evil for evil unto any man, but ever follow that which is good, both among yourselves and to all men, whether you happen to be working in politics or not, or as a police officer, or just as a bricklayer. Verse 16, rejoice evermore. Pray without ceasing. In everything give thanks, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus concerning you. Quench not the spirit, despise not prophesying, prove all things, hold fast to that which is good. This one is a key. A lot of Christians don't catch this, but prove all things, that means test. Test to see whether they are true and righteous things. So when somebody tells you something like, oh, I don't know, you're watching news on the television, and somebody says that your presidential candidate did something, prove it. Don't just take their word for it. Test it, verify it, prove it, and then hold fast to that which is good. If that person lied to you, maybe you ought to stop listening to them. And then verse 22, abstain from all appearances of evil. This means that all Christians, all believers in God, in Jesus Christ, in the Holy Bible, should be involved in politics because the laws of our country allow it. That means not merely voting, but advocating for the good leaders and their policies, standing up for truth and condemning the lies and the evil, investigating what you are told. Because believe it or not, there's lots of lies in politics. Demand justice. Fight for biblical and ethical standards in every walk of life. All right, that's what the Bible tells a believer to do. Now, then we come to the verse in Matthew 22 that people use to say that Jesus advocated for separation of church and state. And that's paying taxes and following laws. Basically, the background story here is, I believe it was the Pharisees were trying to trick Jesus into refusing to pay taxes so that they could get the Romans to arrest him because they hated him, right? Verse 21, Matthew 22, verse 21 says, then saith he unto them, that's Jesus, render therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. Now, this is often taken out of context to say that government has to be separate from God. That's not what the context is. The purpose was to confound the Pharisees, to basically not let them trip him up, and to prevent Jesus' arrest because it wasn't his time yet. Jesus was affirming that following the laws of the land that you're a citizen of, the land that you belong to, is right. as long as they don't cause you to do sinful things. And you have to read the whole context. This had everything to do with following laws and nothing to do with keeping God out of politics or the government. Hebrews 13:17 says, "Obey them that have the rule over you and submit yourselves, for they watch for your souls, as they that must give account, that they may do it with joy and not with grief, for that is unprofitable for you." Notice, for they watch for your souls. This is talking about a specific type of government, one that cares about God. All right. Jesus was all about obedience to the government unless they went against God. Romans 13:1, "Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation." Now, a lot of people stop there. Don't. You've got to read the next verses. Anytime you take a verse out of its context, away from the other verses around it, you're in danger of misinterpreting or misusing God's word. The very next verse, verse 3 says, "For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil." This is a very clear distinction here between good and evil rulers. So it's saying, obey the good rulers. "Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. For he is the minister of God to thee for good." The powers that be are to be the ministers of God to help you. "But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid. For he beareth not the sword in vain, for he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that does evil." If your government is not attacking evil, then this passage is not for your government. Then verse 5, "Wherefore you must needs be subject yourselves to these powers, not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake. For this cause pay you tribute also," taxes, "for they are God's ministers, attending continually upon this very thing. Render therefore to all their dues, tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor." All right, and then don't forget Acts 5:29. "Then Peter and the other apostles answered and said, We ought to obey God rather than men," because the people of their government were telling them to stop preaching. Reminds me of COVID a little bit, doesn't it? Were you one of those weak pastors that gave in and closed your church? Yeah, I'm talking to you. Sorry, that one irritates me a lot. Listen, Jesus never advocated for Christians or apostles or disciples or preachers to stay out of politics. He talked about being different from the world. He talked to slaves. He talked to slave owners. He talked to husbands. He talked to wives. He talked to workers. He talked to bosses. And he told them, be different, be better, for the purpose of telling people about God. How can we possibly say that that translates to not getting involved in politics? You can't. Now, let's get into what the law in America actually says and why people say this separation of church and state thing.